So I want to welcome everyone to the book launch event for the Ride of Her Life. Let me get sorted here. Okay. For the Ride of Her Life. All right, now I'm officially starting. I hope you participants are here. Hi, I'm Kimberly from the Country Bookshop, and I want to welcome you for the book launch event for the Ride of Her Life, the true story of a woman, her horse, and their last chance journey across America. Before I begin, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Country Bookshop in downtown Southern Pines, North Carolina. First of all, thank you for choosing us to work with you on your book launch day. We are also a unique bookstore in that we are part of a small community, twice weekly, award-winning newspaper called The Pilot. We are a general bookstore for kids and adults that is part of a community that chooses to shop with us and share their stories and lives with us and celebrate the lovely thinking and writing like you have given us in your books, as well as those books in bringing these books off the page with conversations like this one. I'll post links to buy all the books in the chat, and let me introduce our two fabulous horse people authors who we are all going to get to listen to speak today. Denny Emerson held an event at the Country Bookshop for this book, Know Better to Do Better. Now we'll put the link in the chat to buy this book. He and his wife, May, run Tamarack Hill Farms in Stratford, Vermont, and in Southern Pines, North Carolina. The Tamarack Farms Facebook page has become a beacon to those who love horses, with over 100,000 followers. He and his wife have two sons, Rhett and Jamie. He is a graduate of Dartmouth College and originally taught high school English and sold real estate in his native Vermont. A lifelong fascination with horses, which we will hear much more about today, led him to eventing. And Emerson was part of the team representing the United States in the 1974 World Championships that won the gold medal. He was named Rider of the Year in 1972, and in total rode in 53 seasons of competition, including 45 consecutive seasons of eventing at the preliminary level or above. Emerson has adopted endurance as a passion and competed in the 100-mile rides and the Tevis Cup. He served as president of the USEA from 82 to 84, and again from 91 to 92, served as the USET vice president of eventing for 7 years, was a member of the USEF executive committee, and chairman of the Breeders' Committee of the AHSA. Now, to introduce Elizabeth on her special day. Launch day is always so special for an author, so thank you. She is the author of The $80 Champion, a book Southern Pines embraced with gusto, and we will never forget your special visit to the store. This book has also been adapted into a book for young readers, so it's available in the chat for if there are any young readers who you think need that book as well. She is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Perfect Horse, The Daring U.S. Mission to Rescue the Priceless Stallions Kidnapped by the Nazis. And this book she will be discussing with Denny Emerson today, The Ride of Her Life, the true story of a woman, her horse, and their last chance journey across America. Elizabeth was born in Southern California, where she spent all of her time on the back of a horse when she wasn't reading a book. She graduated from Yale with a major in history and then joined the Peace Corps. After her Peace Corps service, she studied at the Yale School of Nursing, where she trained as a certified nurse midwife. She began publishing books while working and raising 4 children. Her books have been Indie Next, Library Reads, Junior Library Guild selections, and a Goodreads Reader's Choice finalist. She has been honored with the 2017 PEN USA Award for Research Nonfiction, the Daniel P. Lenahan Award for Media Excellence from the United States Equestrian Foundation. And while she lives in Southern California, she also spends her summers in Northern Michigan. I want to welcome you both and thank you for being here. And I will turn this over to Elizabeth. Thank you all.
Well, Kimberly, thank you so much for being there for the launch of my book. I have really lovely memories of being there in your shop, not virtually 10 years ago. And I want to say that I'm very, very honored that Denny agreed to join us today to talk about my book. There is no person who really would be better suited to talk about a book that includes a Morgan horse, riding in the 1950s, endurance riding, and kind of all things about the culture of horses. So I'm very, very excited. We're going to have a conversation, which I hope will go a lot into the background of the book and the world that created this story. I'm just going to say a quick bit about what The Ride of Her Life is about. It's a true story of a woman by the name of Annie Wilkins. She was 63 years old and she lived in Maine. This is in the year 1954. She had lost her farm to back taxes. She had no family, and she had very poor health and been given just 2 to 4 years to live if she lived restfully, which of course was impossible as a person trying to run a family farm alone. And basically her story seemed to be over. I mean, she was supposed to go live in the county charity home and kind of peacefully live out her days. But Annie had other ideas. She decided to buy a horse with a little bit of farming money that she had pulled together, take her dog, and she had always wanted to see the Pacific Ocean just once before she died. So she set off from Maine in November, hoping to beat the snow and hoping that she would make it to the Pacific Ocean. So I want to start by, I'm going to sort of talk, we're going to talk to Denny, and I want to find out some of the background of this story. He's in a really great position to talk to us about. And so Denny, the first thing I wanted to ask you is really a straightforward question. What is a horse capable of? Annie got on this horse, no idea what she was doing, started to ride about 10 to 15 miles a day, usually on pavement. She had no training. She'd done no endurance, anything. So for a horse to be able to do that, would the horse have to be some kind of a special horse and she just got lucky? Or can horses do more than we think they can?
I think she got lucky. I have one of those Garmin distance watches, that does speed and distance, because I'm doing competitive trail and endurance riding, and it tells you how fast you're going. And a horse at a normal sort of a normal walk goes about 3.5 miles an hour. If a horse is really on a good flat, if it's a big walker, it might go 4 miles an hour. A horse that's poking along or in bad terrain, 3.2, even as slow as 3 miles an hour. And so if you figure how many miles a day at a walk, because she walked, I would think, almost the entire way, at 3 miles an hour, and she's going 3,000 miles, right? I mean, just that's a long, long way. And the horse had to get fit as it went, because it wasn't fit. I wouldn't have imagined when she bought it. It would have been sitting in a field somewhere in Maine. And so my guess is that she probably rode, what would you think, 7, 8 hours a day, 6, 7, 8 hours a day, with stops to let the horse graze, with stops to eat, with stops to use the bathroom if she could find one, with, it's just, and so if she was averaging 15 to 17 miles a day, I'm guessing that would have been a pretty good day. I was reading about the wagon trains that would go across the plains, and they might average 8 miles a day. So really? They'd get up in the morning and they'd see a mountain, and they'd travel for days, and the mountain wouldn't seem to be getting any closer.
Yeah, in the West.
So I think she got a horse that was intrinsically sound, had good feet, the feet didn't fall apart, must not have had any ligament or tendon problems, probably was a compact enough horse to be able to handle her weight plus all the stuff she had hanging on the saddle. And she probably went slowly enough that it just kind of, it brought it into shape as she went.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you could tell from the journey a little bit when I was looking at the map, certainly in the very beginning, it was more like 5 miles, 6 miles. And she did have the horse very, very loaded down with not just herself, but with kind of everything she could carry, with no real idea. And somewhere along the way, she went and weighed herself and the horse. And that was when she realized she was carrying about, with her gear and herself, probably about 250 to 300 pounds.
That's a huge amount of weight. If you look at some of those old cavalry manuals, U.S. cavalry manuals, the mounted trooper they wanted the cavalry wanted about a 15 one-hand horse, and they used Morgan's a lot as well, to carry a mounted trooper with all his kit, which would weigh about 185 pounds.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
so to go 30, 40 pounds more than that before she got the pack mule, the pack mule,
Right.
or horse rather, the saddlebred, the Tennessee walking horse. Before she got that, she was really overloading that horse.
Yeah. Well, that's what, and he was a relatively small horse, and he was
Yeah.
built pretty compact.
Yeah.
He had that kind of.
But a smaller,
back.
we have a lot of friends around here that have Icelandic horses,
Yes.
and some of them are like 13.1 or 13.2. And I've seen full-grown people riding them. That the smaller, more compact horses can handle more weight relative to their size, I think, than a bigger
Mhm.
horse,
Yeah, that's
because
interesting.
everything's in a
Yeah.
smaller, tighter package.
Mhm. And he was a smaller. I think he was probably about 14.2, 14.3. Large pony size. And she was a short woman, but kind of stout.
Yeah.
But she was carrying a lot, and she started to kind of. She did lighten her load rather than make it heavier, because in the beginning she just didn't know whether she took some hay and some grain and stuff with her, not enough for 3,000 miles, but she did start to jettison some of her belongings, because she realized that one of the things about this journey that was so charming was she planned to kind of sleep out, and of course it's November in New England, but she was getting so many invitations to sleep in that she didn't have to end up carrying as much with her.
Yeah.
But I describe her as kind of an untrained endurance riding. So we were talking about the horse, but let's talk a little bit about the rider. She didn't have any real equestrian training at all, but she was walking on a horse. Endurance riding. So you're still an endurance rider now, but it was has a long history. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think endurance riding just simply means, today it's a different context because it means a competitive sport, but distance riding, people would set out from Maine to travel to California in the the gold rush, and they would ride across the country, and it would take them months. And and before that, we had the Native American tribes who had the horses that they lived on horseback. And before that, you had the Huns and the Mongols and horse culture goes way, way back, thousands of years, where people have traveled huge distances on horses. So I think horses are used to, it's probably the most natural thing you can ask a horse to do of all the different horse sports, because they do it without you. If they're grazing, they go from this point to that point, to that point, to that point. So horses are used to going across the country. And, but to do it with a rider, where they're not allowed to stop and graze every time they're hungry. I can remember reading an article about cavalry, that as long as they walked, they could refuel at the hours that they were staked out at night. As long as there was grass or something for them to eat, they could refuel from a walk. But the minute you trotted, you burned more calories than they could refuel, and the horses started to lose condition.
Oh, interesting.
Which is interesting. I had never considered that. In other words, you're riding, I don't know, Custer is taking his troop across North Dakota into Montana. And as long as they can stop at night and pick at them or do whatever they did with them and eat, they will kind of maintain their weight. But the minute you go faster, the calories overcome the amount that they bring in. The calories lost overcome what they bring in at night from grazing.
And that's just grazing with whatever they find along the way.
Right. Annie, at least, she got a lot of people where she would stay. They would give her hay and grain, and so I think her horse and then later horses were probably better fed than cavalry horses or Mongol horses or Cheyenne Indian horses.
Yeah, yeah, well, that's interesting. Yeah, because one of the things when I was doing the research on this book starting out, I was kind of puzzled about how it was that this horse was going to eat. And in particular, I was puzzled about how the horse was going to drink. And I mean, I would like you to tell me, because you are a New Englander and you have experience on all these rides, I mean, I only know about watering horse. I don't with a bucket because
Yeah.
I'm from
Well,
California.
they won't drink until they get thirsty. On endurance rides, a lot of times they're so jazzed up that first 20, 30 miles, even though they probably need to drink, they're probably starting to get dehydrated. You'll stop at a water tub, and if other horses are in the distance, they'll spin around and they won't drink. But once they get thirsty enough, they'll drink, and they'll drink out of a tire track if there's water in it. You know, a good distance horse will drink wherever he has a chance to drink. And the other thing you see on endurance rides or any distance rides is people that have come to a grassy spot beside the trail, and they'll just stop and let their horses eat. And a lot of times I'll use a hackamore on a horse just when I'm doing distance, just simply because they can eat and drink more easily. You know, it's easier to eat and swallow without a bit in the mouth. So, and green grass will hydrate them a little bit as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that'll nail you on a distance ride as fast as anything is lack of gut sounds. If they're not refueling and, you know, keeping their hydration up, they'll get in trouble really quickly. And of course, in the winter, it's a lot harder because, you know, everything's frozen. I don't know how she did it.
Well, you know, it's interesting with Annie, a lot of the water came from gas stations.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I found fascinating about this time period was this was a time when she had a mindset of the idea that you could get on a horse and ride across the country as people did in the 19th century. Yeah. Because she kind of came from this rural area that just didn't really know that much about the world. But the world was changing very, very rapidly in the 1950s, particularly in relation to cars, which we're going to talk quite a bit more about. But so she would kind of ride into the gas station very often when she was fueling up. She would fuel up with water and fuel herself with food with the little diner gas station combo. And then, as you said, you know, she would graze the horse if she could find, but of course this was the winter, and then the horse was fed hay and grain very often that was volunteered by people who would give her a barn, a place to stay. So I want to talk, so our time period here, this is the mid 1950s. And when you look back at her story from the point of view of a 21st century person, maybe you love animals, maybe you love horses, but you might be somewhat surprised about Annie's relationship to her animals. Clearly, she very much loved them, but I'm wondering, she also was less trained, but maybe in some ways more comfortable with her animals, or more confident that she could do what she wanted to do with them.
Well, if she was 63 in 1954,
yes,
when deduct 50, you know, she would have been anybody when she was born. What year was she born?
1891, I think.
So everybody that she grew up with had horses as transportation, farm labor, military, you know, basically that, you know, so she grew up in a world where horses were used by everybody. If you wanted to go to town, you hitched up a horse and you drove to town. If you wanted to hay your fields, you hitched up the mower, hitched up a team of horses, and you went out and mowed the field. You know, I was born in 1941, and everybody, you know, when I started riding in 1950, we moved to Greenfield from Exeter, New Hampshire in 1950. You know, everybody 50 years old or older had been born in the 1900s. And so there was still, when I was a kid, there was still very much a prevailing ethic that horses were to use. That, you know, we didn't have, quote, relationships with our horses in those days. You never heard the word dressage. You didn't hear about putting a horse on the aids, or the, you know, all the stuff that we take for granted today simply didn't exist. Or if it existed, it didn't exist in rural Cowtown, Greenfield, Massachusetts in 1950. And so, people had learned, even if she grew up on a farm, she'd learned a lot of this stuff simply by osmosis.
Mhm.
I mean, her parents would have had work horses. Her neighbors would have had driving horses. Horses were the way you got around. It was simply just part of the woodwork.
Yeah.
You didn't think about it. It wasn't an unnatural thing. It was just,
Yeah.
it's the way now you go out and get in your car.
Yeah. I mean,
Way-
so you've been working with horses for so many years, and I'm just curious in your own personal experience, like, so you've seen both sides.
Yeah,
how do
when
you
I was a
see-
kid,
How do you see it different?
there was much more of a, you got to show that horse who's boss kind of mentality. Don't let him get away with that. I mean, that's one of the things that took me a long time to sort of figure out, is that if you're trying to use horses in sport, a horse basically, I was thinking this the other day, you have a relationship that you want to create between one species, which is essentially a predator, right? Humans. Another species, which is a prey animal. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? And so you've got to understand that you, the human, has the reasoning power. The horse isn't going to change. The one that's going to have to change is the person, or not. And I think that a lot of horses in Annie's day were treated as basic chattel.
Mhm.
You work them, and when they get too old to work, you put them down and you got another one. It wasn't a question of relationship. So it's very different.
Yes, I mean, I think that's such a good point, and I think it's interesting to see, because you could see with somebody like Annie, completely ordinary person, she has no special training, and yet she's quite adept at managing horses. I mean, she kept
She'd have been
almost
around horses from the
falling
time
off.
she was born.
From she was born, and of course, most people nowadays, they have nothing similar to that experience. Even if they spend a great deal of amount of time, they're not going to rack those hours that somebody like she did.
Well, I was
did.
doing an article one time, just one of those between rounds things for the Chronicle, and I looked up US population 1950, and it was about 150 million.
Mhm.
And then today it's what, 330. So it's
Yeah.
more than doubled.
Yeah.
And the projection is by 2050, it'll be 400 million. So, but the other thing that I think people don't realize is when I was a kid, there was the thing known as the family car. Hey, Dad, can I borrow? I've got a date Saturday night. Can I borrow the car?
Yeah.
It wasn't a question that you had a car, your husband had a car, and your two teenage kids had a car.
Uh-huh.
So now there's so many more cars on the road.
Right.
Compared to and right behind Greenfield, Mass, the school, Stoneleigh Burnham School in Greenfield, I could ride through the woods. When I was getting ready for my first 100-mile trail ride, which was the summer of 1956, I could ride through the woods, hit Swamp Road, turn right, which is north, ride 8 miles, and cross the state line into Vermont. And I had 100 miles of dirt roads to train on. Today, you go halfway into those woods, and there's Interstate 91. Bam. To the south, where I rode my horse down to visit my friend Jack Baker in Whately, 17 miles. To the south, bam, there's Route 2, the interchange. It's like a cloverleaf.
Yes, the cloverleaf, which I talk about in the book.
Housing development, it's totally changed. And it's this way, and you take that little insular pocket, and you multiply that out over this whole country. And I don't know how you could do what she did today without getting killed in the first 10 miles.
It's really one of the things that just really, really struck me. First of all, I love, the family car that you're talking about, because one of the things that really struck me when I was doing this research was the 1950s and cars. So I found out that by the middle of the 1950s, 1 in 6 Americans was employed in the automobile industry. And the number of cars was exploding. And it was just like you said, it's kind of like the analogy would be like the iPhone when nobody had one.
And then everybody.
All of a sudden, and you realize that you've entered this whole new world and you don't even really realize it. And
Yeah.
that's what was happening with the roads at that time,
She was
1954 to
just
1956.
she was just early enough,
Yes.
right? 54, 55. If it had been
Uh-huh.
58, 59, I think would have already, I mean, she was just early enough.
Just early enough. And so, and when did, I'm trying to think when 91 went through. You know, she was
91
coming down from
was
Maine.
being built behind the school. And when I was at Dartmouth, I remember there was a section of it built in 1959, my freshman year.
Okay,
And by
yeah.
my senior year, I could get on the interstate in Greenfield, which was 63. I graduated. I could get on and drive to Windsor and only have about 20 miles of Route 5 left.
Mhm.
So
Right.
it was right at the 59, 60, 61. That's what the whole Eisenhower interstate system started to get kicked into
Yes,
gear.
56 was when the Interstate Highway Act was passed by
Yep.
Eisenhower. And of course, they were talking about, I talk about in the book, the mile-a-minute highway, which was, interestingly enough, Maine was really a state that had very few roads. I don't know if Vermont is comparable, but Maine, originally all the settlement was in from the coast, and so it was all waterways. And there were great parts of the states that didn't have highway access, but the whole thing was to get tourists up from Boston. And so they had the second major modern interstate in Maine after the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And when they unveiled the first section of it, they called it the mile-a-minute highway.
Yeah.
And that was this shocking thing that you could drive a mile in a minute going 60 miles an hour. But I was so fascinated because they said that prior to that, it took all day to drive from the Massachusetts border up into Maine, up as far as Portland, or I think it was maybe as far as Augusta or something, because it was the road itself and the little tiny one-lane highways and everything was so slow.
Yeah, we moved to Stratford, Vermont here in 1970, 50 years ago. And I was talking to a neighbor who had been the columnist they had a newspaper that covered this general area, the Upper Valley, they call it, of Hanover. Mm-hmm. And they would have an article like this: Mr. and Mrs. John Smith recently visited their daughter in White River Junction from Stratford. Today, everybody commutes to White River Junction, Lebanon, but it was it was newsworthy that you would go 20 miles, 25 miles.
Oh, I mean, I'm laughing because I do a lot of my research in old newspapers, and the number of little notices that I read like that, and the local news around Annie, that's what it would be. Yeah. She was really so isolated that I think that she didn't know. She just, I mean, it's not like she had never been out of Maine, but she had still sort of lived in a pattern that was
like you point out in the book, no maps. She'd get the map maybe at the gas station of that state, but she didn't have any way to put Massachusetts in relationship with the other states.
Here we go. This is what I was using. I tried to retrace her steps, and it was so confusing. This is Arkansas. It was so confusing when I was trying to retrace her steps looking at Google Maps. It was my first thing. I'll look on Google Maps. Well, you couldn't tell at all because the roads are still there, but they're all back roads now but yeah, they're so fun because I'm sure you remember these, right? But they're compendiums of information.
Well, the other thing, Elizabeth, if you notice on the old maps, you've got them there, they'll have orange or yellow around a population center, right? And then green in between.
Yeah.
And now it's all yellow because everything is kind of interlocked. There's no, it used to be, I remember down the Connecticut River.
Up for you here.
Yeah, I did an article on Justin Morgan's trip from Randolph, Vermont, down to West Springfield in 1791 or 90, they don't really know for sure, to get figure, to bring him back. Justin Morgan had a horse, right? And so if you look at if you go down the Connecticut River, it goes Hanover, or White River Junction, Windsor, Springfield, Bellows Falls, Brattleboro, Greenfield, Northampton, West Springfield, etc. And the towns were about 18 to 24 miles apart. And I asked a historian here, a guy named Euclid Farnham in Tunbridge, I said, how come? And he said, because you were never more than 10 miles from a town. No matter if your farm was in between, you could hitch up your cart and go 10 miles to town at the most. He said, it was not an accident that they were like beans on a string, the placement of the towns, because you had to be able to drive to them.
Drive your team.
The cart,
Yes,
on a
exactly.
horse at
Yes,
3.5
horse.
miles an hour.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that was really interesting. And I noticed that down, I mean, all along the Eastern Seaboard, you see it. As she was passing through Pennsylvania, she was riding along a road, which at the time was called Ye Old Nottingham Highway. And it was where Lafayette and Washington went on their way to the Battle of the Brandywine. But it's the same thing. There would be these, basically taverns. And the taverns would always be about 8 to 10 miles apart. And they were always along that road. So you see those little traces were still there when Annie was alive. Yeah. And also, as you mentioned, the Connecticut River, one of the things that does come up in the book, because she's also, at one point, she's following the Connecticut River. And it was really sad. They were talking about Springfield and how they had built the highway immediately next to the road in such a way that it cut off the waterfront from the rest of the town. Whereas that had been a route that had been traveled for before, with Native Americans, and then when the settlers had come, et cetera, it was a long standing footpath along the banks of the river. And there was an article in the New York Times just a few days ago where they were talking about how a lot of places are now trying to fill in some of those highways, actually regenerate them. Get rid of.
Well, I like the way the way you take a place that Annie's going through and then do kind of historical perspective of the place. Really adds so much dimension to your book, because you're not just seeing Annie just trudging down the road. You're putting it in a context.
Yeah, like I mean, and it's so interesting when you do that, because you're at this time period where the world is just accelerating. When I was 1953, Greenfield, Massachusetts had its 200th anniversary, and we were going to have a big pageant. And so I got picked. I was in 5th grade to give a ticket to the oldest Greenfield resident, Mrs. Stimpson, and she was 100 or 101. And so I think it was because we shared our birthday. We were both born on August 20th. Oh my gosh.
And so I'm sitting there talking to her, and she said, now, are you going to go to the parade tomorrow? Which was this big parade through the middle of Greenfield. And I said, yeah, I'm riding my pony in the parade. And she said, when I was your age, I can remember going to a big parade, and it was in Springfield. And I went down to Springfield, Mass. And I went down to it was at the railroad station, and there were bands and there were crowds, and I was little, so I couldn't see above the head of the crowd in front of me. And all I could see was this line of bayonets going by. So I was talking to a lady that watched the Civil War soldiers coming off the train after Lee surrendered at Appomattox.
Unbelievable. That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean,
wow.
I talked to somebody that watched the Civil War soldiers come home.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah. I mean, talk about compression of history.
It was so interesting when this book, The Ride of Her Life, one of the resources that I was able to use was a memoir that Annie Wilkins herself wrote that was called, with a co-writer, called The Last of the Saddle Tramps. And I was interviewing the daughter of the co-writer, who very graciously allowed me to use anything I wanted from Annie's memoirs. But anyway, she told me her father was a Civil War veteran.
Yeah.
This woman that I interviewed for this book, and it was the same kind of thing. I guess I'm sorry, it was her grandfather. But still, I was like, that's just not so far away. She was, I think, 86 at the time that I interviewed her.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. But to see, and also, I love that you're mentioning parades, because parades really featured a lot in this book, especially in New England.
Parades were a
New England
big
just
deal.
loves a parade.
Yeah.
But every time she'd come into town, somebody would say, let's have a parade. And
Yeah.
I thought, how did they pull that together so fast? So is that just a New England thing?
No, because remember the Rose Bowl one that,
Well, that's true.
no, I think it was, there were horse clubs. When I was a kid, there were horse clubs all over the place.
Mhm.
4-H clubs, Brattleboro Riding Club,
Uh-huh.
Mid-State Vermont Riding Club. And, they would have a parade or a function at the drop of a hat, just
Yeah.
because there were a lot of people with horses. There were a lot of horses around,
Yeah. So that
40,
I thought that
50,
was, I found from
60
my
years ago.
modern perspective, I kept thinking, well, she just rode into town and now they're having a parade. But you're right, because sometimes these saddle clubs would come out to greet her, and that people would hear sort of through word of mouth or from local newspaper articles that she was coming, and they would send out a booster party to greet her, and that suddenly there's the mayor and he's driving down the town square with the American flag, and there's
Yeah.
Annie on her horse.
I have a question for Kimberly. Kimberly, do you remember telephone booths?
I do, but my son definitely does not. I had to carry quarters to call my mom to pick me up at the movie theater.
Remember when the only way you could make a call was if you could find a telephone booth, and usually the phone book was in tatters on the floor, and there was gum and junk and dirt and
notes everywhere.
Notes everywhere.
Notes, yeah.
And sometimes the phone didn't work, or you'd run out of dimes, or you didn't have the right amount of change, or, so that's only 20 years ago.
Right.
So the thing that I was thinking when I was reading The Ride of Her Life is, here's Annie. If she'd had a cell phone, like all those times where she got in real bad trouble, like that time in New York where the truck hit her.
Yeah.
If she'd had a cell phone, so many of the problems she experienced, she was flying blind. It'd be like going across the ocean if you're Columbus.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
It boggles the mind, because she didn't have any. Well, she eventually started getting these maps. People would
but people would tell her, go down that road, and
go down that road.
And
I got a friend in the next town, but she didn't have a phone. She didn't have a GPS. She didn't have a bank account. She didn't have a credit card. And she had a 6th grade education, which is not uncommon for women of her era. She was a farmer, and she had been a proud union owner and worked in shoe factories, which was a really big thing in New England, because they couldn't make enough money on the farm. So she was constantly farming at nights and the weekends, bringing cash in from the factory. Yep. She'd worked hard, but she didn't, even when she planned her route, I mean, if you look at her route makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. She kind of, and you said 3,000 miles across the country, but I think she really ended up going about 5,000 miles.
Because she went north to get south. Yeah.
And she hitched a ride when she got to Unionville, Pennsylvania. Somebody took pity on her and said, you're a lot farther from the south than you think you are. I don't know how soon she thought it was going to get warm.
And really when they brought her up to Kentucky, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she was, from our perspective, I think that besides the cars, really the information, our access to information versus theirs, our ability to plan and predict versus somebody who was doing something at that time. But then there's also this kind of mindset of blind faith, I guess, that, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that too. She just, we would worry ourselves to death wondering what was going to happen, but she had this kind of,
well, I think one of the things, and you mentioned it a lot in the book, is she trusted people. Mm-hmm. She trusted the good nature of the average American citizen. And she assumed that most people would help her. Like, remember when she came to that farmhouse and the woman just told her to get out, go away, and then the husband came later that night to apologize?
Exactly.
You know, that was an aberration, that somebody would not sort of take, I don't know if pity is the right word, but have compassion, you know, and try to help her out. And you know how so many of those people said spend the night, you know, or even in the town jail. That happened a lot of times, where she would get a warm bed, a meal, and then they would give her $5 or $10, which is a lot of money in 1955.
It would.
And so she sort of traveled on the kindness of it was a much more neighborly spirit, I think. I mean, today, you know, the average American has watched way too many Criminal Minds episodes. You know, you don't even open your door to, if you know the person.
Yeah.
It's,
Well,
it's
I mean,
so changed.
I have a little story to speak to that, but I guess it was during the beginning of the pandemic. I had noticed that there was somebody coming around at night and picking up recycling cans, and this is when everything was shut down and people were quite desperate. And my husband said, "Let's set the recycling cans aside so that they're easier for this person to pick up if that's what they're doing." And so we did. And then a few weeks go by, and it was about 10 o'clock at night, and there was a knock on my door, and we don't, you know, I live in Los Angeles. I don't get a lot of knocks on my door at all, much less at 10 o'clock at night. Well, there's this person standing there, and I recognize him because he's wearing a spelunking light when he goes out and gathers the cans. And I ask him what I can do for him, and he hands me my cell phone, which I had left sitting on the recycling when I had been out, and he gave it to me. And you know, and I thanked him profusely and offered him a reward. And he said, "No, I'm just, you know, I'm doing for you what I wish that somebody would do for me." And that really touched me, because I thought, you know, here I'm, and I guess I am sort of more of a trusting person in a way. I've had a lot of experiences of people doing kindnesses for me. But there you go. I left my phone out in the street, and this man he ended up telling me that he had lost his job due to COVID, and that he was gathering cans because that was his only source of income. I didn't stop him from bringing my phone to my door, you know?
Yeah.
So I guess I believe that kind of what you said, that maybe we're more suspicious than we need to be sometimes.
Yeah, but maybe not today.
It's hard to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but certainly in Annie's day, I think that social trust, you see that social trust.
And especially growing up in New England, small town USA, I think, you know.
Well, in small town USA was probably the biggest thing that was really changed by the coming of the cars. I mean, that was really what I saw, is that, and of course there were many, many other things that made small towns change as well.
Yeah, the huge demographic shift from 150 million to 330 million did not happen uniformly across the United States. There's still vast parts of Kansas that are just still wheat fields. It happened in places that already had people that had jobs. And so you've got these intense corridors of, like, you know, I when we go down to Southern Pines, Kimberly, from Stratford, it's right down, you know, you hit Hartford, Connecticut, New York City, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. It's just in traffic. We hit traffic 100 miles from our house, and we don't get out of traffic till we turn onto Young's Road. And that's another piece of this puzzle, you know, that Annie would have had to get through those corridors.
Yeah.
There's places in between when you can still do what Annie did. But how do you get through those corridors that are just like wall-to-wall subdivisions,
Right.
Shopping malls, suburban sprawl, where one town just merges into the next, into the next, into the next. I mean, that is, and it's only getting worse. It's one of the reasons that I'm a member. I go to these trail rides, you know, and people are saying, you know, why aren't there so many people doing the 100-mile trail rides anymore? where the heck are they going to get their horse fit? You know?
Mhm. Well,
I
and
was
even
in
this idea
Greenfield.
that,
I could get my horse fit in Greenfield, Massachusetts in 1950. If I lived in the same place today, I couldn't do it. You know?
even in Annie's day, that was what was so interesting, is that every town still had some farms, still had
Yeah.
some, really, she skirted New York City, but most places, there was somewhere around there. Also, well, there were a lot of rental stables, there were a lot of riding stables, recreational riding,
Yeah.
more than there is now. And then just an old farmer who his farm hadn't been subdivided yet. You saw that a lot. And that is a major, major significant change.
Yeah.
But while I still have you, because we've talked so much about that time, but because I have Denny Emerson here, I really want to ask you just something about this. I want to talk a little bit about the rider-horse relationship, and what is it that makes it special, and what is it makes it different from any other kind of animal-human relationship?
Well, you're being carried by a living creature that does not always do what you think it's going to do. Like with Annie, every time a big truck would come by, what's his name? Radar? What was the name of the?
Tarzan, or
Tarzan.
the dog, yeah.
Tarzan would spook and the other horse wouldn't, right?
Yeah.
And Tarzan did not like trucks. So every time she heard a truck coming, she had to sort of, here comes a truck, get
Yeah.
ready, because she knew he was going to spook.
For 5,000 miles.
Yeah, for 5,000 miles of spooks, right? So when you're riding, it's not like riding a bicycle or a motorcycle or driving a car or anything like that. It's a relationship that is always a little tenuous because nothing is ever fixed. It's in constant ebb and flow, and even though you may think that you have a well-trained horse, you don't know what's going to happen when you're out on the trail. Trail riding is so different from ring riding. Ring riding is predictable. You've entered the dressage ring. A, enter working trot, sitting. X, halt, salute. Proceed, working trot. C, track left. Blah 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 blah. Or you're on a cross-country course and you know you've walked the course 3 times and you know you're going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 or whatever, or show jumping around or whatever it is. When you're trail riding, where you'll get nailed is when you've been out for 2.5 hours, you're coming home, your horse is walking along with his ears flopping and you're sort of sitting there, I'm almost home, and a bird flies out or a deer jumps up and your horse is gone right up in front of you.
And you too.
Yeah. And so it's never, ever predictable.
Mm-hmm.
Ever.
Yeah.
And I don't care how quiet the horse is.
Would you try to ride a horse across the country, or you think that's a thing of the 50s and wouldn't happen?
It's a thing.
now?
Well, no, I wouldn't, because I've had traffic is there. People have no clue about a horse. We have a neighbor right around the corner here who has just been building a giant indoor ring. And as a result, these huge gravel trucks have been all last summer and a little bit this spring have been trundling up our little dirt road. And when they come down, you know, they make that muttering sound, a big diesel, and they're coming down the hill. And, you know, most horses will see that thing coming at them and they're gone by, see it, right?
Yeah.
The things are gigantic. The drivers are not used to coming around the corner and seeing a horse in the road.
Mm-hmm.
They don't expect it. They couldn't stop half the time if they wanted to.
Yeah.
Plus they're reaching down to push the cigarette lighter in or do something, you know, they don't even notice. And oh my God, it's like that horrible movie where the truck hits the kid and she loses her leg.
Oh, the Horse Whisperer, is that?
Yeah, I mean, but that's real.
Yeah.
That's today. That's 2000. That's 2021. It's like that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do it. I mean, listen, Kimberly, Young's Road, you know, I see cars going by my farm on Young's, you know, where Tamarack is, Tamarack Lane on Young's Road, 65, 70 miles an hour. Early in the morning on their way to Fort Bragg or coming home from something. If you're trying to cross the road and your horse is spooky, That's Young's Road. They used to hunt down the middle of Young's Road when Mrs. Moss was around. It's
I
changed.
guess it's, a lot of it is what you're saying, because now, I mean, we certainly have many riders and horses in this country and many people who care about them, but it is a much smaller percentage. And you have to assume that the majority of people, they don't know. They don't know. And I think that must be a permanent change, which is maybe why it's nice to revisit a story like this one and kind of get to go back and remember a little bit how it used to be.
When you read about Annie and that trip, it almost could be 1850 in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And you think, how much of this could I replicate today? And there are places where you can, but there are places, so many places now that you can't. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great. I loved it. I think it's a great book.
Yes. Do we
As
have
we're
time to
moving
take a couple
into questions, one thing I do not want to miss, as we were just opening this to all of our attendees, Denny, you mentioned that you were reading a little bit from your diary from the 1950s and talking specifically about just the work, like the blacksmith coming and what was it like to have a horse in the 1950s? And I think,
well, when I was 14, my parents ran a school in Greenfield, Mass, Stoneleigh Prospect Hill School, it was called in those days. And they had a school library. And in the library, they had a magazine rack. And I saw a Green Mountain Horse Association brochure that talked about a 100-mile trail ride. I was 13, I think. So it would have been 1954 or 53, something like that. And I decided I wanted to do it. I don't know why, I just decided I wanted to do it. So I wrote to GMHA and I said, can you send me an entry blank? And they said, well, we will next year, because it's already happened this year. It was in the winter, I guess. And so I just started to get my horse fit. I had no clue. I mean, I had zero clue how you get a horse ready for a 100-mile trail ride. I just assumed that you had to ride a lot. And so this is an entry from Monday, June 11th, 1956. I got up fairly early and saddled, this is my little diary. Saddled Bonfire and started down to Whately. It took quite a while. And when I got there, I put Bonfire in the pasture for the rest of the day. I think the trip was about 17 miles, the furthest I have gone yet this summer. Tuesday, June 2nd, 1956. Jack and I rode down to Louis Goodyear's this morning and had lunch down in Sunderland. Jack saw and tried out a bay horse, which he seemed to like very much. It is a good-looking animal with a lot more life than Scout, which was his other horse. We didn't ride back until it got cooler. I think it was a 14-mile ride, etc. It was a different world. You could ride from Greenfield to Whately. You could ride from Whately to Sunderland, in 1956.
And you were riding on the roads, or were you just riding on the roads? And how did you know where to go? Did you use one of these?
No, I guess I don't know how I knew. Somebody knew. We used to sneak Jack's car. Jack's father was deaf. And so we would take his car out of the barn, the garage, at night. We were 13 and 14 and drive it all around Northampton and Greenfield. And Jack said, watch for cars, see if there are any cops following us. So what was I going to do? Jack, there's a cop following us. You're 12 and you're driving on the highway. Little boys should not be allowed out.
Oh my gosh, that's so wonderful.
You have any sons, Kimberly?
I have two sons, and yes, I think the worst ideas are the best ideas, consistently.
Anything you think that they might get into, they can and will. Yeah. Anyway, so.
Well, that was a treat. Thank you for that. Now, there are a few more questions, and there's been some feedback about how many people listening are really enjoying this conversation, mine included. The first question is a comment about horses being described as dolphins of the land, and just encouraging people to get back in touch with the animals and the land and the combination. And then there are two other questions about your writing process, Elizabeth. The first is, when writing nonfiction and trying to keep an entertaining storyline without turning the writing into a term paper, do you have any suggestions in keeping the work accurate? And then there's a second question about the most difficult part about researching this woman's story and talking with, was it relatives, speaking, interviews? And I'll let you assess those as you will.
Sure. Well, I mean, I can speak to, I'll speak to the second one first, which was how I researched it. And yes, it was quite difficult. Before we started filming, Denny asked me what it was like writing this, because I didn't have a live person to interview. Obviously, Annie Wilkins has been gone for quite a long time. And that was also the case when I wrote my World War II story, The Perfect Horse, my last book. But when I wrote the $80 Champion, I had Harry DeLayer, who was the star of my story, was alive, and I was able to interview him. So it is quite a different process. And when I start out with a story, the first thing I have to do is just to find out if there is enough information really to write a book. And then if there is enough information to write a book, then I have to decide whether I have anything interesting or additional to bring to the story that makes it worth me being the one to tell it. So in the case of this one, what was a lucky stroke was that Annie Wilkins wrote a memoir in the 1960s that was called The Last of the Saddle Tramps. It is out of print now, but it's an interesting story, and she kind of tells her story of how she rode her horse across the country. She worked with a co-author. So I was like, when I read it, I thought, this is not written in the style of a person who actually is an uneducated sixth grade education. Somebody must have helped her with it. Well, indeed, it found out that she collaborated with a woman who was a reporter. It was a very interesting woman in her own right, who was from Maine and was kind of a pioneer woman, very well educated for her era. And she had taken a shine to Annie. And she's the one who really got to start publicizing Annie's story by writing about her in the Lewiston and Auburn newspapers. Well, this woman, Mina Titus Sawyer's daughter, is still alive. Her name is Crystal Decker. And so I was able to meet with Crystal. Crystal knew Annie, and Crystal knew the whole story of how this had come together. So I was able to interview her. I found people who had met Annie along the route. And I found Annie wrote a lot of letters back to people that she had met along the way. And some of those letters had been preserved. And then there were also, for those people who are no longer there, sometimes there were people who, when she stopped and stayed with, maybe it was their mother or a member of their family. So I did find some people who remembered Annie and Annie's visit, and some people who could just tell me about the family members who had hosted. How did I find out who hosted Annie? Mostly local newspaper articles. But the hardest thing about writing the book really was because Annie was a woman. She was not particularly educated, not very wealthy, not notable in any way. There was nothing about her that suggested that she would leave a story behind. And so some of the details of her life, I really had to go into census data. I worked with a genealogist to track back her family history and find out more about her farm, about her family, about her previous marriages and everything else that happened to her, because a lot of that had been sort of polished off in the retelling, particularly in the 1950s. She was a divorced woman with no family, when you were really supposed to be either, a widow or a wife or somebody's mother, and she wasn't any of those. But so it's a process of a lot of digging around in a lot of documents that helps you put the story together.
The next question is for Denny. Denny, can you compare Sally O'Connor's ride with her son's cross country to Annie's?
I've never talked to any of them about that, David or his brother and I. So I don't know how they got across those big interstates. I don't know if if you come to Interstate 89 or 91, you either have to go over it or under it. And so you're going to be on paved roads with fast traffic. And they did that, what, 30 years ago? Sally and David and
Was it the 70s?
Brian.
Maybe? I think it was maybe in the 70s.
Huh?
I thought it was like 73, 74. Is that too long ago?
No, 50 years ago, whenever they
Yeah.
did it, it still would have been much, much tougher than when Annie did it in terms of traffic. And so I'm not the person to ask, because I've never sat down with David or Brian and said, how did your mother do that without getting you all, run over? Because it doesn't seem possible to me. I can't imagine trying to get through some of those corridors of intense, like get around Chicago. You get around Philadelphia today, you get around Cleveland, you get around, Denver, you get around any of those metropolitan areas, and it's just crazy traffic. I mean, crazy traffic driven by crazy drivers. And yeah, I don't know. I can't answer the question because I've wondered about that myself. We need to ask.
Me
Brian.
too. Me
If they
too. I was
remember.
thinking
They
it
were
would be a
little,
very
probably. I
interesting
don't know if they can
conversation.
remember.
Well, before I ask you each one final question, I do just want to mention that the link to buy the book is in the chat. If you are local, you can come get it, or we'll deliver it, not by horseback, but by car to your door. Or if you are far away, the link to our website, we will send it anywhere. And I wanted to ask each of you just before we close, if there's anything that we haven't, Denny and Elizabeth, either that we haven't touched on in our conversation that struck you while reading the book or while writing the book, or just that we should leave our audience with as we end this really wonderful chat.
I had one thought, because when you started Elizabeth, she was given 2 to 3 years to live. And she lived many, many more years after that. And so I wondered if what it was, Elizabeth, that you think reinvigorated, regenerated her. How did this trip change her from a dying person to one that had a quarter of a century still to live when they told her she was dying?
I think it was just basic hope. I think, and I'm fascinated by just ordinary people who suddenly say, no, you're not putting me on the shelf. I have something else to say. She was so marginalized in every way when she had nothing really going. And when they said, well, go live in the home, she's like, we don't think of 62 or 63 as being very old now. But in those days, for a working class person, that was geriatric. Mm-hmm. And she was expected to go sit in a rocker for the rest of her life. And she knew she wasn't ready to do that. And you can really see it. I mean, there aren't pictures in the book, unfortunately, because most were not good enough to reproduce. But as you watch her progress across the country, it's so fascinating. She went from kind of looking embarrassed and sheepish and sort of like, what am I doing here, to really being proud. And I think that's what it was. I think she probably wasn't going to die at that time. She had tuberculosis, but there were treatments for tuberculosis, which they weren't sure how well they would work. And so I guess they did work in her case. And she had some emphysema and she had bad pneumonia. But I do think most of it was just that. It was just this, she went from being nobody to being somebody that people thought was important enough to pay attention to. And I think it was that.
Wow. Yeah, cool. Yeah, great story.
Thank you. Well, and I think for me, and what I would like to say is I have read Denny's books. I know do you have a new one that's just about to come out?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I would like to take this time to say I highly, highly recommend them, because you are literary in your writing style, and they're so enjoyable to read and so fascinating. And so that's what I would like to say is Denny is not just an amazing horseman, but he's also a very, very fine writer. And I encourage you to read his books.
Oh, thank you.
And we will have those as well. I want to thank you all for attending Those of you who are here, obviously registered, will email you a link to this so you can share it with friends and or watch it again. And I just really want to thank you for supporting loving horses and supporting our riding horse people. That's a terrible way to close, but I'm just so happy to have this conversation.
Well, thank you to the Country Bookshop for having us. And Denny, I'm really so thrilled that you were willing to do this for me. For me, it was incredibly fascinating to hear you talk, and I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, well, I love the book, so.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
We're done? Okay.